Greetings, everyone. I hope you are fine. I hope you are doing well. And I will appreciate if you can just smash that subscribe button, that like button, like never before. Every time I talk about Jacob Zuma or MK Party, I often hear people say, why now? Why Jacob Zuma is doing this now? If Jacob Zuma was serious about the issue of land and the African way of doing things, he could have done so while he was still a member of ANC or while he was still a president. So I have my views on this issue, and I would like to share my views together with you. But before I can do that, I just want us to watch this short clip of Nelson Mandela, probably in 1992. Let's hear what he had to say.
The ANC does not believe in socialism. We are a broad national movement which combines various strands of political thought, ranging from the far right to the extreme left, embracing liberal and conservative views. And if you study our basic policy document, the Freedom Charter, you will find that it is based on free enterprise. And the land, for example, there is no nationalization of the land. And the land is subject to individual ownership. And in actual fact, when the Freedom Charter is applied, when the provisions of the Freedom Charters are applied, capitalism amongst Africans will flourish as never before. I wrote an article in 1956 to this effect, to say private enterprise, when a democratic system is introduced, will flourish in this country as never before. And the only exception is a clause which calls for the nationalization of the mines, the financial institutions, and monopolies. That is done because of the conditions in the country. It's a clause which was actually adopted in the constitution of the present ruling National Party in the 40s. So there is nothing unique in that. There is no element of socialism in the policy of the ANC, whatever may happen in the future.
I just want to begin by saying, if you start a church in a community, especially in a community where there's no church at all, if you establish a church, many people will flourish in that particular church. Why? Because in their minds, they think everything is about God, everything is about praising God, everything is all about talking about the Almighty God. So they will definitely flourish in that particular church. But as time goes by, you'll start realizing that other people now are in disagreement within this church. Other people are disagreeing within this church. And there are those who will be just fighting for leadership. I'm not talking about those people, because there are people who are just fighting for leadership because they want to be in front. But I'm talking about those people in a church who are concerned about theology, who are concerned about doctrine. So these people will start disagreeing now based on doctrine, based on all these different practices. That's when you'll start seeing other people like leaving the church, because you cannot fight from within, especially if majority of people are disagreeing with you. Even if you are right, even if you have a good a vision that can benefit all people, the community, the society, But there's no way you can win that battle from within. That's why you'll end up seeing people who have been in a certain church maybe for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, leaving that church after so many years being in that particular church. In most cases, it's not because of fighting for leadership, fighting to be in front, and etc. There are those people who are just like disagreeing based on theology. And these people are patient because they think that they can or they will end up winning this battle from within, when in reality it's impossible, especially if these people whom you are disagreeing with have a majority. It's impossible. So same applies when it comes to the politics of ANC. I always say, if you look at the politics of ANC before 1994, because sometimes we always say 1994 was a scam, 1994 was like this. But if you look at the politics of ANC in the 60s as well as in the 50s, then you will realize that ANC had already started compromising. That is why when you hear most of these politicians talk about the history of ANC, they don't want to talk about 1912. They don't want to talk about 1913. They don't want to talk about that time period, because now their focus is in the 1940s, their 1950s, their 1960s. And if you make your research very well, then you will find out that that's when ANC started compromising. So how can we witness this? How can we prove this? We can prove this by PAC in the 60s. Then PAC was formed out of African National Congress, because most of black parties in South Africa came out of ANC, or let me just put it this way, most of the political parties in South Africa came out of ANC. Those people were once the members of ANC. So this split started during the times of ANC. Now, during the times of PAC, then we experienced a split. Now we can see this split. Now we have PAC, now we have ANC. Why PAC was formed out of ANC? Same applies to the church. The issue of doctrine, theology, and etc. So when it comes to politics, it was this issue of policies. In other words, there are people who started realizing that ANC was already compromised. In the 1960s, there are people who started realizing that now ANC was no longer preaching what they thought ANC was preaching, because when ANC was formed, it was all about the struggle of the people. That is why people were not asking if what ANC was fighting for. They started joining ANC because they were like, we are oppressed, without being aware of these things of policies. So in the 1960s, now we have someone like Robert Sobukwe and others, other members of ANC, other members of PAC. They started realizing that ANC was now compromised. That's how PAC was formed. I always say, if you study those politics, then you will understand that in 2024 or in 2029, there's absolutely nothing you can expect out of ANC, especially when it comes to the poor, especially when it comes to those people who are vulnerable. Let me just make another example. Let's say right now you start a non-profit organization, and this non-profit organization is all about the poor. Maybe fast forward after 30 years. After 30 years, now this organization has a new leader. That leader can change the policies. Now this leader can come and say, you know what, this organization is no longer only about the poor. This organization is about the poor and the rich. And in that process, you'll start realizing that the poor are just being used as a vehicle to compromise everything, when in reality now this organization is concerned about the rich. So at that point in time, there's absolutely nothing you can do in that organization, especially if the majority is against you. This is what is happening in African National Congress. This is what we need to understand. So fast forward now in 1994. So 1994 was not a surprise, especially to the members of ANC, AZAPO, and others who were already aware that ANC was compromised. So when Nelson Mandela and others made those decisions, many people, especially those of PAC and others, were not surprised at all. That is why I repeat again, if you study the politics in the 1960s as well in the 50s, 40s of ANC, you will understand that there's absolutely nothing you can expect out of ANC. Then fast forward, then UDM came out of ANC. I don't know, maybe it was the issue of leadership or the issue of policies, but we see a split. Then fast forward, we have COPE. I don't know if when it comes to COPE, there was the issue of leadership or maybe the issue of policies and etc. I may not be 100% certain about that, but we saw that split. But I just want to talk about ANC under the leadership of Jacob Zuma for a moment. At that time, ANC had the strongest youth league ever, according to my opinion, under the leadership of Julius Malema. So now within ANC, there were people who were like, we have to put to use these policies such as expropriation of land and everything. That is why Youth League at that time was radical. And they were certain that it was possible to change ANC from within. But later on, they started realizing that there's no way. You cannot fight against ANC from within and win, especially if the majority is against your views, if the majority is against your policies. It's just a bit impossible. Fast forward, EFF was formed. So EFF is the only political party, or is one of the political parties that I can say it came out of ANC, not because they wanted leadership, but because they were fighting for policies. They were fighting for the implementation of certain policies. But they realized that there's no way you can fight from within and win. Then EFF was formed. That is why EFF has unique policies, and they are consistent about their policies to say expropriation of land without what? Without compensation. They realized you cannot fight against the beast and win, especially if the majority are against your policies or are against you. Then now, fast forward, we have the formation of MK Party. Now we hear Jacob Zuma talking about land. Now we hear Jacob Zuma talking about the African way of doing things, the African laws. Now we hear Jacob Zuma talking about the recognition of kings, the elders of the people here in South Africa. Then here is my view. There was no way Jacob Zuma would have implemented all these policies within ANC. It's impossible. If you want to implement these policies within ANC, you must have majority when it comes to leadership. It's not only about the president. That is why an organization has the executive leadership. So same applies to African National Congress. African National Congress has what we call executive leaders and many other members who are in control. It doesn't mean if you are a president, you can just turn things around. It's impossible, especially when it comes to ANC, because ANC was compromised long time ago in the 1940s, in the 1950s, in the 1960s. And people were joining ANC at that time because it was a popular organization and people were under struggle. People were like, we want to come out of this struggle. It's only few people in those times who realized that ANC was already compromised. It's only few people. Because if the majority of people were aware that ANC was compromised, ANC would not have won the elections in 1994. So the ANC or ANC organization won the elections in 1994 because majority of people in South Africa were not aware that ANC was compromised. They were just fighting to be free. So the only famous organization at that time was African National Congress, when in reality, it was already compromised in the 1960s as well as in the 1950s. So right now, as we speak, there's absolutely nothing if you are poor. That is why I always beg people who are poor and be like, you have to vote for someone who speaks for your needs, who speaks your language, who empathizes with you, because African National Congress doesn't empathize with you based on history in the 1960s. That is why we have this clip here of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela made it clear. Nelson Mandela made it clear that in their policies, this man was the leader. And then he was like, there's no nationalization of land. He put it clear in his words. And you can tell that Nelson Mandela here was in a comfort zone. He was in a comfort zone. You know, sometimes when you are in a comfort zone, there are echoes around you. You're comfortable, you're fine, you are happy. You don't want people to disturb that happiness, that comfortability. You don't want people to disturb you at all. This is my perception. I'm not against the ANC, but based on history, you can tell PAC came out because they were like, we want land. Other organizations came out. EFF came out. Now we have MK Party. MK Party came out of ANC. So what does this mean? It means from within, there's absolutely nothing you can do. You cannot fight with ANC from within. For an example, if you listen to some of these political members of ANC, you can tell some of them have conscience, but they are not aware that you cannot fight the beast from within. Sometimes if you are listening to someone like Mr. Mantashe, you can tell that this man has conscience. Yes, we may not agree with everything he says, but you can tell that deep down in his soul, he has conscience. If you listen to someone like Panyasa Lusufi, you can tell that this man has conscience. We may not agree with him with everything he says, but you can tell that this man has conscience, but they are not aware that you cannot fight against ANC from within, especially if the majority are against your policies. It's impossible. That is why you have to come up. That is why I'm like, the only thing the Progressive Caucus has to do is to focus on unity. Because the right wing is already united. ANC, DA, and others are already united. Even though they are not united to the core, but they are like, in order for us to be victorious, we have to come together. So same applies to the left wing. They have to come together and say, in order for us to deal with the beast, we need togetherness. And I believe that Nelson Mandela here was in a comfort zone.